I know it's 2 o'clock. I've sent.
Chair, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, Member Murray, I sent her the WhatsApp link, but it doesn't seem as if she is Parliament. I'm just going to give it a few minutes. So, colleagues, thank you for joining me at 2 o'clock on a Friday in the graveyard shift. As usual, I always appreciate your commitment to the budget of the Western Cape Provincial Parliament. My name is Deirdre Bartman. I'm chairperson for the committee. Ms. Kamish Ahmad, has IT started the recording for YouTube?
Yes, Chair.
Thank you so much. Colleagues, it is also Masinkli's birthday today, our committee assistant, and I hope that you join me in welcoming her, congratulating her a very, very happy birthday. I hope you have a wonderful year and that it may be prosperous, and we really appreciate the work that you do for the budget committee and the commitment to be in this committee even on your birthday day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair.
With that, colleagues, we are now going to introduce ourselves. Members, if you can please introduce yourselves, and then I will welcome the Financial and Fiscal Commission. Today, we will be getting the inputs on the budgetary process for 2023.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ricardo Mackenzie.
Good afternoon, Chair. Khalil Brankes.
Thank you so much. Any other members?
Good afternoon, Chairperson and colleagues. Kilian Bosman.
Thank you so much. Any other?
Afternoon, Chairperson. This is Member Nkondlo.
Afternoon, Member Nkondlo. Okay. With that, we'll be leading the Financial and Fiscal Commission delegation. Is it Ms. Barber?
Good afternoon, Honourable Chair, members. It's Chen here, taking care of the today's presentation on the Chairperson's behalf, if that is in order, and of course, as always, protocols observed.
Thank you so much. Always wonderful having the FFC before the committee. It's one of the organizations that we've seen have done absolutely excellent work when it comes to financial research. You may go ahead, Mr. Chen, and as normal, members will have question and answer session after the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all. And this year we are presenting the 2023-24 divisional revenue, our annual submission. But of course, despite the, shall we say, always the presentation, but we shall also have all the technical work that's being done in the background, and it's available on our website. Chair and members are, of course, welcome to visit and get into the technical bits. Without further ado, this year our theme is addressing socioeconomic vulnerabilities through fiscal transparency and strategy. And if I may, just to get off on the heated side of things, yesterday we were at the select committee with the joint chairs of the provinces and COPs. And a question came up: what do we mean? Aren't our budgets and fiscal transparency and strategy clear enough? Because we have a pretty good record of budget transparency, and the answer ultimately is we think as FFC that it's not clear enough. Actually, if it was clear, then we wouldn't have all this state capture and corruption and all these weaknesses within our system that's threatening our fiscal sustainability. But I'm getting ahead of myself. But overall, the context why we are presenting or have chosen this theme is that over the past 2 years, of course, the government has tried to balance the maintenance of fiscal sustainability alongside the need to provide social relief interventions. And these persistent, long-standing issues of poverty, inequality, and unemployment, but of course also these shocks that's disrupted the flow of things, shall one say. This effort, of course, has also been marred by a myriad of delivery shortcomings and as I said, weaknesses, particularly around those fruitless and wasteful spending that we see so glaringly in the Zondo Commission reports. And so this submission, separated into 3 parts, puts at the front and top of the pile is of the corruption and unemployment, the challenges. And then part 2, we look at the empirical analysis, examining economic and fiscal situation. And third, the intergovernmental fiscal relations system and instruments. And that include ourselves. You'll see there, chapter 10, it's as FFC, as an instrument of fiscal and financial institutions and influencing and informing, supposedly doing our job, but the budget and also the fiscal framework overall. The context, current economic context, is that due to this rebasing of GDP and others, we have recovered to, one may argue, a pre-crisis level. However, as always, whenever there is, we hear changing in the master samples or the sample size or the sector's sample size of GDP, one is always to take it with a pinch of salt. Because what happens is that the lens of measuring economic productivity has changed, i.e. rebased. So at the point ultimately is not as much as it's about have we returned to the pre-crisis level, but rather it's about what are the changes in between. And of course, underlying it is we are looking at significant structural changes potentially within that change in economic productivity. deficit is due to the commitments made in the MTPPS and also in this recent budget. And going forward, the MTF is that we shall reduce budget and attempt to stabilize our debt. One may ask, despite all that work done on the deficits, why is our debt stock and debt to GDP still increasing? And that is because that even though with active management of debt, one is forced, as Minister is allowed to, also by the PFMA, is to push all that commitments and redemption obligations further out into the future. And that also has its associated cost to do with interest payments. And so it's a very, very long road to recovery, one shall say. As I said, structural changes underlying that dip there in terms of unemployment rates. And recently, it seems to have tapered off, although it's in terms of numbers still quite significantly higher than pre-crisis level, and also always persistently high throughout in the past decades. I shan't go too much into these, except to say that when it comes to youth unemployment, it's incredibly concerning because unemployment has a way of sort of building its momentum to be resistant to any sort of interventions that one may make on it. For instance, it's actually quite simple, really. Imagine if a young person that comes into the market unemployed, and the longer that he or she stays unemployed, the less and less employable that person becomes, as the skills and education and all those things becomes obsolete and or further and further away from what is needed in the market in terms of skills and soft skills. So this is 24, first chapter, strategies on preventing corruption in public services and funding for anti-corruption agencies. Basically, it's a combination of looking at the budget allocation, how these institutions are funded, and also in the context of the recent Zondo Commission reports. Our findings I shall rush into, go straight forward, is that first, legislative and public finance management reforms are critical in the fight against corruption. That goes without saying then that reforms, especially in terms of the public procurement system and accountability mechanisms, needs to be made clear and are vital. And that transparency is vital to combat procurement-related corruption. And also the same is applicable to also budgeting and how that procurement plan is funded and or resources are allocated in relation to in order to buy those goods and services from the markets. And third, in terms of institutional analysis, we realize that there are quite a significant portion of overlaps in between mandates of anti-corruption institutions and that meant to combat corruption. And so it might be a issue of cost efficiency as well as effectiveness. When there are many sort of overlaps and lack of coordination, things tend to become a bit of a chicken game whereby nobody is clear and all wanting with the incentive to fulfill and achieve its mandate. Culture of non-consequence management. I want to be clear in that this issue of consequence management is really about the accountability chain. If, say, the first level, and this can be found in a PFMA, if the officials, delegated officials fail, then it's the accounting officer that needs to take into action. If the accounting officer fails, it's the executive authority. If the executive authority fails, it's the parliament. And the committee, which is the purpose of this committee, needs to act. And the similar, and that's the chain of accountability and oversights and institutions needs to be installed and be executed in that matter. The political will, ethics and integrity, institutionalization in government, and to ensure and society as a whole participatory. And this is where transparency is so important, and also information. A lot of these corruptions tend to happen under the table and under the cloud. So one way, important way to address these things that is such as corruption is through information transparency and open transparency. I shall further move to essentially our recommendations. Essentially, we're calling for the renewal of the structure of this structure of the governance structure of the anti-corruption agencies through a strategy, and further is that it should consider not the centralized public procurement, the CSD that we are also very uncomfortable about, but rather a authority that can help to show greater transparency, to make the process and procedure of procurement clearer, and so that we don't have to deal with these instructions after instructions, and then one day later, a practice note suddenly comes online, and then a couple of years later, it's again revoked. And of course, the recent triple PFA that the judgment on it by the Constitutional Court is quite clear in showing that weakness there. A dedicated or joint civil society organization should be established that educates and empowers society about the dangers and adverse effects of corruption and advocates in that manner. I think South Africa in general, we're not short on that, but it's about the corruption actually really happens at the point of execution. Chapter 2, unemployment. Also, another salient issue that aren't short on the number and of agencies and initiatives undertaken by the government, right? I mean, we have the NYDA, CETA, notwithstanding all the grants, the EPWP, social and the expanded and the broad-based interventions that is in place. However, in terms of findings that our research has shown on the evidence is that first, spending and increases in taxes have not resulted in a reduction in unemployment. Let me repeat that. What that's saying is that increases in government spending have been associated in increases in unemployment rate. And then one may ask why that is. And that is, and the answer, economic answer to that, when we find something like where spending increase with unemployment, and in the macro level, is what we always call crowding out effect, right? Is that when there is a additional spending incurred, that it actually doesn't make conducive the market. Instead, it actually jeopardizes it. And that is crowding out effect. The evidence also shows that government investment has increased unemployment. Therefore, combining with the first evidence, research evidence, is that it's not how much you spend, it's actually what you spend on, which is quite intuitive in the sense that especially gross fixed capital formation expenditure in the composition of the budget should be progressively increased to decrease unemployment. Labor market interventions, we see no significant impact on reducing the high unemployment rates. This should be a direct, shall we say, a derivative of just the very first one, is that when more you spend on these so-called programs and so forth, as in the current structure that they are not effective in essence to reducing unemployment rate. So ultimately, we're looking at our FFC research has shown that a lot of these interventions are mainly on the supply side, labor supply side of things. It's not looking enough at why aren't there enough jobs. Another way of looking at that is why aren't there, we are asking the question, why aren't there enough demands for these labor supply? So, and this is where we come to this structural constraints and rigidities, and we ask the question why there is such a high barrier for a market labor supply entrance, and to absorb these new entrants, and educated or not educated, ultimately, well, the supply side matters. It's not met with the corroborating increasing demand. And so from those evidences that we've researched, ultimately is, again, it's not how much you spend, it's what you spend on, that it should be more about a gross fixed capital formation. It's about investment, and not just any investment, but investment on the demand side, the job demand, shall we say, the job creation side of this expenditure that shall help in reducing unemployment. Those I've already emphasized enough about the NEET, the needs, those not in education, employment, or training, and it's incredibly important to see them that it's. If we don't address it today, it's only going to get much worse later. I shall therefore from here hand over to Gianni to take you through the second part of our annual submission. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairperson of the committee and members. I'll be taking you through part 2. So that covers chapters 3 to 6 of this year's annual submission. So chapter 3 deals with assessing debt sustainability in South Africa. As we know, the COVID-19 pandemic brought about a rapidly changing economic climate that has highlighted many of our fiscal vulnerabilities. And one of those vulnerabilities is the rising public debt, which has been the cause of much concern. So when it comes to the public debt levels, as well as the cost of debt and the future debt path of South Africa, our country still faces a lot of uncertainty. Although debt levels are lower than in many advanced economies, the cost of servicing debt in South Africa are substantially higher, and this is reflected in the interest rate. Rising debt service costs continue to crowd out expenditure on basic services, which is concerning, and these concerns are particularly worrying amidst the projections of weak economic growth, which are averaging at around 1.8% per annum over the next 3 years. So the aim of this research is really to understand what debt sustainability means for South Africa amidst this volatile economic climate. And to do so, the research relies on a variety of key sustainability indicators and quantitative tools to assess a number of things. And these include what it means to have a sustainable debt path, whether our debt path is sustainable and whether debt is sustainable, as well as looking at the relationship between debt and economic growth. Next slide, please. In terms of the findings and what it means to have a sustainable, to have debt that is sustainable, a sustainable debt path would be one where the fiscus is committed to stabilizing debt through a variety of avenues. And this includes mitigating debt service costs, adjusting the primary balance, as well as improving growth and productivity in the economy, while simultaneously protecting the needs of its population. The graph on the left-hand side shows the comparison between the real growth rate and the real interest rate over time. And what the figure shows is that since 2014, the real interest rate has been persistently higher than the growth rate. And this indicates a high interest growth differential. So this is not favorable towards debt sustainability, given that the interest rates are closely related to the higher cost of debt, and given that lower growth is associated with a higher debt to GDP ratio. The research also revealed other indications of unfavorable debt conditions, and these include sharp increases in the debt stock and debt service costs, unproductive debt, and vulnerabilities to macroeconomic shocks. So overall, the research finds that debt sustainability appears to be quite weak in South Africa. Furthermore, there was a regression analysis into the debt growth nexus, and this examined the impact of debt on economic growth. And what this analysis revealed is that high debt levels are associated with deteriorating economic growth. However, it's important to bear in mind that this relationship between economic growth and debt is a non-linear one, meaning that the debt growth relationship can run in both directions. Finally, in terms of the future debt path, projections indicate that debt levels and financing needs are vulnerable to adverse shocks to the primary balance, the growth rate, the interest rate, as well as to deviations from proposed fiscal consolidation. Further shocks to the macro economy may destabilize the debt path, and raise additional financing needs. Next slide, please. The recommendations for this chapter are fourfold. The fiscus, firstly, through the Minister of Finance, must strive to rein in rising debt service costs, as this comprises a substantial portion of the budget and detracts from allocations for the provision of basic services. Furthermore, the Commission supports pro-growth fiscal consolidation and any efforts to reduce the borrowing requirement. Secondly, the Minister of Finance, it is recommended to exercise and maintain fiscal discipline via active debt management and regular reporting regarding debt accumulation, costs, and sustainability under the current strained debt conditions. Furthermore, it's noted that this discipline should be exercised throughout all spheres of government. Thirdly, weak productivity and expenditure should be addressed in order to create job-enhancing and income-generating growth that is inclusive through quality expenditure and investment-enticing reforms. And then finally, it is recommended that investor confidence be boosted and promoted through signaling that public debt is sustainable in the long run in order to reduce our sovereign risk ratings and thereby the cost of debt, as well as to ensure the continuation of economic support. Thank you. Next slide. That brings us to chapter 4, which deals with affluence and inequality in South Africa's labour market. As we know, income inequality has remained persistently high in the post-apartheid era, and this undermines inclusive growth. It constrains aggregate performance of the economy, and it also contributes towards social unrest, which costs the fiscus billions of rands. Slow and stagnant economic growth over the past decade, alongside suppressed and unequal growth in wages, has limited the extent to which cash transfers such as social grants, can reduce income inequality. This also raises concerns for long-term fiscal sustainability, given that the state is highly dependent on sources of revenue such as personal income tax. So the aim of this chapter is really to investigate earnings inequality in the labour market using labour market data, and to look at earnings trends across different income groups to see where there's stagnating wages, where there's growth in wages, in doing so, not only show the extent of inequality, but also identify some key shortfalls in the policy environment. Next slide, please. In terms of the findings, we find that income inequality compared to various countries across the globe, both advanced and emerging economies, BRICS countries, the Gini coefficient is well above 0.6. So that confirms, similar to what other papers have found, and still amongst the highest in the world. Looking at how total monthly earnings is distributed across the population, almost half of total monthly earnings in real terms went to the richest 10%, so the top decile of the population. Only 11% went to the poorest half of the population, so the bottom 50%. And this is significantly less than the 17%, which accrued to the most affluent top 1% of the population. Wage growth between 1995 and 2017 appears to be slow across the entire earnings distribution, with, of course, the exception of the top 1%, who have seen substantial income gains over this period. The study also took into account some demographic features, looking at gender and racial inequalities in the labour market. And not only did it reveal that there's this persisting gender wage gap in the labour market, it also indicated that decades after the end of apartheid, earnings inequality is still highly segregated along racial lines as well. Then there was a brief analysis into industries, which revealed that the economy tends to be dominated by the services industry across all earnings groups. Finance tends to dominate amongst the most affluent, while trade, domestic services, and agriculture are more prominent amongst the poorest half of the population. It was also found that the number of persons employed in the manufacturing sector has declined between the years in the analysis, between 2010 and 2017. Next slide, please. Based on these findings, 2 recommendations are made. The first one is aimed at policies that activate the labour market, and this speaks to what Chen was saying earlier about how we can increase demand for that match skill sets of the working age population. So what the first recommendation says is that policies aimed at reducing inequality should really be targeted as a point of departure at the labour market, as this is where a lot of the inequality stems from. This requires policies to enable large-scale job creation and more equitable wage growth across different sectors of the economy, and which in turn may require great investment into labour-intensive industries that are able to absorb more low-skilled workers into the labour market. Secondly, and finally, on this chapter, is a more technical recommendation dealing with data and analysing inequality with household survey data. It is recommended that Stats SA should increase its efforts to enhance transparency of data and harmonisation of data sets, and because this will allow for more comparable, accessible and reliable income statistics. And just noting there that transparency should extend to data collection, data cleaning, as well as imputation methods applied, as this could really impact the credibility of one's analysis. Thank you. Next slide. So chapter 5 deals with social grants and household consumption behavior. In South Africa, South Africa's social grant system is widely successful as it can reach millions of South Africans and reduce poverty. Typically in social grant studies and looking at the effectiveness of a grant system, various studies have focused on the impact on poverty and inequality, but seldom has the impact on consumption been looked at. So by observing at changes in household consumption behavior and expenditure patterns, this research investigates the dynamic impact of social grants on social grant recipients, while also then measuring the impact on the fiscus. It's just noted here on the slide, over 30% of South Africans receive a social grant monthly. And regardless of the strain it poses on the fiscus, the demand for social grants is increasing rapidly due to the struggling economic conditions that we presently find ourselves in the country. Next slide, please. So in terms of the findings, they're broken up into 3 parts. Firstly, the case study on the social grant network. The social grant system is highly efficient in reducing poverty and inequality. And the research finds that consumption and savings in productive economic goods, such as food, education, and healthcare, increase with the receipt of a social grant. It serves millions of South Africans and achieves many of its policy intentions. However, it is not readily evaluated by the Department of Social Development. And this is just shown by the fact that the last investigation took place in 2002 with the Taylor Commission, and that was the commission that first recommended the basic income grant. Secondly, in terms of financial and fiscal impacts on the national budget, the social grant system is undergoing immense year-on-year expansion, and this is increasing the demand on the national budget. Still, the limited fiscal scope of the government limits the ability of policies to attain optimal welfare outcomes. And then finally, the econometric analysis into consumption trends and the impact of the child support grant in particular on consumption between grant recipients and non-grant recipients. The research findings suggest that recipient households' consumption increases positively with the receipt of a grant, especially concerning items such as food and healthcare. It was noted that grant recipients tend to spend less on education, but the explanation from this could be found in the fact that they have increased reliance on publicly funded education. Next slide, please. So 4 recommendations are made in this chapter. First, it is recommended that the amount of the child support grant in particular be recalculated, as the grant is currently not really calculated using a specific metric or policy amount. Secondly, it is recommended that there be better partnership between the public sector and the private sector to support child support policy intentions. This can be done by, say, creating incentives that are aligned with certain policy intentions, and for the purpose of mitigating any inefficiencies associated with unconditional cash transfers. Thirdly, it is recommended that social grants be integrated better with the existing social development programs. So, for example, the child support grant could be combined with early childhood development programs as a means to improve expenditure efficiency and really maximize social outcomes. And then finally, it is recommended that there be an in-depth investigation into the current social grant network, and that this investigation really look at the dynamic effects of all grants on households and businesses' behavior. Thank you very much. Next chapter is on the public sector wage bill, investigating wage trends. So over the past 2 decades, both wages and employment in the public sector have increased very rapidly. And this has generated an aggregate public sector wage bill that now commands a substantial portion of the national budget, at 35% of the government's consolidated spending in 2019. The impact of this on the country's finances has, of course, been a cause of much concern. And in order to really understand the changing composition of the wage bill, understanding this changing composition is really central to managing it. And therefore, this research aims to analyze trends in public sector wages, also comparing them to the private sector, and then to determine its trajectory and sustainability of this growing public sector wage bill. Next slide, please. So in terms of the findings, the graph on the right-hand side really just shows public sector wages or compensation as a proportion of GDP between 1993 and 2020. And this is just one of the findings from the paper. And what it really shows is that the compensation as a proportion of GDP in 1993 was extremely high, and then it dropped very sharply in the mid-1990s. From 2008 onwards, the wage bill increased very dramatically, as shown by the graph. And although the financial crisis would have likely played a role in this decline due to the sharp increase due to the declining GDP, this was mainly due to the sharp rise in compensation as a proportion of GDP was mainly due to administrative changes in the pay schedule that resulted in larger wage increases for public sector employees. It continued to rise, as you can see, to a level above 14%. Next slide, please. So these figures really compare the private and public sector wage distribution for 2000, 2010, and 2017. And what it shows is that the average public sector wage is significantly higher than the average wage in the private sector. And this is shown by the fact that the public sector wage distribution is lying to the right of the private sector wage distribution. It's also found that the gap between the higher and lower earners in the public sector appears to have grown, with wage gains really at the top of the wage distribution, and a slightly larger concentration of lower paid workers. Next slide, please. Finally, the recommendations on this chapter. Firstly, it is recommended that the Department of Public Service and Administration consider balancing notch progression and cost of living adjustments and pressures to the fiscus during wage negotiation. The Commission highlights that the growth of the wage bill has largely been driven by wage increases rather than the increase in the number of employees in the public sector. Secondly, wage growth at the top end of the distribution in the public sector has not been excessive, but after 2010, it appears that wages for those in the bottom 20% of the distribution fell in real terms. So this potentially then widens the wage gap in the public sector. The Commission therefore recommends that National Treasury commissions further research into this to determine what is driving the decrease in real terms for wages at the bottom of the distribution. And then lastly, the demographic composition of the public sector has changed over time, but the proportion of young people working in the public sector has not grown. So the Commission recommends that the Department of Public Service and Administration, together with the Department of Women, Youth and Persons with Disabilities, develop a framework to guide the public sector on the inclusion of youth in the public service. Thank you very much. I will pass on to Shafika. Thanks.
Good afternoon, Chairperson, members. I will take us through the last section of the presentation. So starting with Chapter 7, which looks at a review of the Provincial Equitable Share Formula, the responsiveness to the changing social structure. This chapter assesses how provinces allocates their funding received from the PES with a particular focus on education and health sector. The focus is specifically on whether provincial allocations deviate much from the weightings of the PES formula, how province adjusts when faced with financial pressures, and does the PES consider the changing social structure. This review has been done by analyzing the expenditure trends for both the health and the education sector in all provinces, as well as analyzing the social structure changes in the province for education and how the PES and other fiscal instruments has responded to these changes. Next slide, please. The findings in the review shows that there is an inconsistency between the percentage each province allocates to health and education. This may be as a result of a lack of costing which is needed, or the system to guide smooth allocations of resources. Another finding is that the province spend is a significant percentage of COE in both these two functional areas. For example, in the 2020-21 financial year, the Eastern Cape spent over 90% of its education allocation from the PES formula on COE. The key drivers to province high spending on COE includes wage bargaining processes, which is not taken into consideration when determining the PES allocation. The other major factor contributing to high personnel costs is provinces identified during stakeholder engagement was teacher skills gap. The challenge provinces faces is that it is difficult to reduce spending on COE. Provinces then reduces funding on goods and services. This will ultimately compromise the quality of education, as a shortage of learners' support material affects education quality. Another way provinces addresses the shortfall in funding is the delay of replacement of teachers, as well as the freezing of posts. Provinces has also confirmed that in an attempt to deal with funding pressures on education and health cuts are made on funding to other departments. Next slide, please. In line with the Commission's recommendation on a costed norms approach is recommended, full costing exercise should be undertaken by all provinces, particularly for the provision of education and health. The costing results will be used to determine allocation by provinces to these key functional areas. This will ensure consistency and fully informed resource allocation. Secondly, there should be improved coordination between the infrastructure delivery plans and programs to ensure alignment between the PES and conditional grants allocation between the National Department of Education, Basic Education, and all provincial departments of education. The third recommendation by the Commission is that the Department of Basic Education undertakes a skills audit to identify the skills gap with respect to the old and the new curriculum, and based on the audit results, identify the number of teachers who needs to be trained and the funding requirements, as well as developing and implementing a training program. Next slide, please. This relates to Chapter 8, which looks at the repurposing and the realigning the system of provincial conditional grants. Conditional grants are used to drive specific national priorities, with some of these grants being in place for over 25 years. Some grants has become a permanent feature of intergovernmental fiscal transfers. The conditional grant system functions suboptimally, and these are characterized by poor design, incentive and accountability for results, protracted existence, fragmentation of grants, intermittent changes, and a deficit in allocation criteria. It is rarely subjected to a regular review to assess the alignment of the system to the best practice principles and design imperative. This review conducted a 25-year analysis of provincial conditional grants, focusing on the following 4 aspects: the number and quantum of funding, any changes made in terms of the introduction of new grants, grant termination, or the absorption of grants into the best allocation. Thirdly, the alignment between the grant design and the policy objectives, and finally, the allocation criteria and the fairness thereof. Next slide, please. The findings of the study found that total grants as a share of the provincial sphere has increased from 11% in 1998 to nearly 20% in the 2020-21 financial year. When compared to the PACE, conditional grants has experienced inconsistent growth patterns. A total of 85 provincial conditional grants has been introduced with a lifespan of 5.6 years. 27 grants has been introduced for only a year, and 4 has been in existence for more than 20 years. The bulk of provincial conditional grants are Schedule 5 grants, with only 16 categorized as Schedule 4 grants. The study showed that Education Infrastructure Grant, HIV/AIDS, and the Human Settlements Development Grant had a number of design flaws, such as poor classification and too many objectives. For example, there is no relationship between the need indicators, which are used in the allocation criteria, and the grant objectives of the Education Infrastructure Grant and the HIV grants. Another finding of this paper was that the longer the grants remained in existence, the more deviation there was in the output and the original grant objective. Next slide, please. The recommendations for this chapter was revising the DORA system of grant scheduling, as it created no fiscal incentive for provinces to reveal their expenditure preferences or sustain expenditure previously funded by conditional grants. Secondly, update the allocation formula for the Education Infrastructure Grant to ensure alignment of the grant need indicators with grant objectives, and further streamline expected and reported outputs to improve focus and ease of monitoring. The third recommendation relates to terminating all HIV/AIDS grant subcomponents unrelated to grant objectives and incorporate them into the provincial equitable share. And lastly, for improved transparency, the grant allocation formula to be published with the grant frameworks. Next slide, please. Chapter 4 relates to budget performance and the constitutional right to basic education. The Constitution entitles everyone to basic education as a fundamental human right. South Africa allocates significant portion of its consolidated spending to basic education. However, recently and specifically since the onset of COVID-19 pandemic, spending on basic education has been impacted by the need to reprioritize and cut spending across government. As a result, key basic education funding sources such as the PES and basic education-related conditional grants has been reduced or subject to slower real growth. Given that this is relatively stagnant, spending is projected to continue over the medium term, there is a justifiable concern that the fulfillment of basic rights will be compromised due to the declining allocation. We acknowledge the need to protect spending on constitutionally protected socioeconomic rights. However, this cannot be done without considering whether the current utilization of public resources are being used efficiently and effectively. The focus of this analysis is to assess the efficiency of the current education spend and to reflect on how spending of basic education can be reprioritized, ensuring that the most essential elements related to right to basic education is protected. The findings of the report, next slide, please. The findings of the report is the efficiency analysis shows room for improved spending efficiencies in education. A proper costing framework exercise needs to be undertaken to determine the adequacy of basic education spending and to appropriately quantify the impact of budget cuts on delivery of basic education services. Existing evidence suggests that if expenditure cuts were to be implemented, they should be apportioned in a way that reduces existing inequalities in the system. Public expenditure on schooling that is not COE related through the quintile formula is inequality reducing. Public expenditure on school personnel is not progressive, as it allows approximately the same resource per learner regardless of the learner or school's socioeconomic background. To aid the use of efficiency analysis and understanding of the link between government spending and school performance, it requires the availability and the accessibility to both financial and non-financial information that is credible, reliable, consistently collected, and easily comparable. Next slide, please. The recommendations, there are 4 recommendations for this chapter. The Commission reiterates its previous recommendation presented in Chapter 8 that a proper costing of the delivery of education services be undertaken to address the cost drivers of education and the differences in spending pressures across provinces to assess the adequacy of basic education spending. Government needs to protect the redistributive nature of basic education funding system in the face of potential basic education budget constraints. The Commission acknowledges the government's work in implementing a school-level data collection. However, the Commission recommends that the Department of Basic Education leverages the collection of this data and other sources of school-level data to compile a consolidated basic education sector database that integrates the financial and non-financial aspects of basic education, and that the Minister of Basic Education should use the matrix as the foundation of a framework to consult broadly with stakeholders to agree on a guide for spending prioritization in the basic education system that is underpinned by socio-economic rights approach. Next slide, please. Chapter 10 deals with the independent fiscal institutions and the effectiveness, a cross-country evidence, common features and policy lessons for South Africa. The analysis assesses the effectiveness of independent fiscal institutions and the influence on fiscal outcomes. 7 international case studies were used. The several international institutions used as part of this case study is namely the High Council of Finance of Belgium, the Parliamentary Budget Office in Canada, the National Assembly Office Korea, and the Council of Budget Responsibility in Slovakia. The use of the Financial Fiscal Commission and the South African Parliamentary Budget Office case study compares the South African experience with the international institution. The aim is to extract the policy lessons for South Africa based on the review of the design and operational features of independent fiscal institutions around the world. Next slide, please. The findings are divided into the following 4 categories. Mandate and function. This showed that almost 75% of these institutions assess macroeconomic and budgetary forecasts. All of these institutions publishes public reports on their findings. With regards to independence, the result shows that more than 70% of these institutions assessed enjoyed legal independence, 86% enjoyed operational independence, and more than 70% can safeguard their budgets. 86% can hire their staff and have access to the information required to accomplish their goals and objectives. Composition and institutional models. In terms of institutional models, more than 50% of the institutions assessed are parliamentary budget office, 29% are under executive, and 14% are standalone institutions. With regards to compliance and impact, 29% requires fiscal authorities to either comply or explain any deviation from the forecast and recommendations of these institutions. 14% are mandated to formal consultation or hearing as part of the budgetary formulation to interact directly with stakeholders responsible for budget preparation. Next slide, please. Chapter 10's recommendations are as follows. There are several recommendations. The Parliamentary Budget Office and the Commission should endorse government's macroeconomic and fiscal forecasts. They should also cost all government policies or legislation that impacts on fiscal policy, and they should monitor compliance with the fiscal rule and objectives. The government should establish a process of periodically reviewing the operational independence of the South African Parliamentary Budget Office and the Commission by instituting a set of minimum standards. The Commission and the South African Parliamentary Budget Office should be provided with timely and comprehensive access to relative information, including the methodologies, assumptions, and data used by National Treasury in budgetary planning. The legal basis for compliance and explanations of deviations from the recommendation principles for the Commission should be strengthened, and the Commission and the South African Parliamentary Budget Office should be formally consulted on budget formulation and execution. Next slide, please. This would be the last chapter of the submission, chapter 11. Relates to district municipalities, its powers, functions, and funding framework. So the district development model was introduced in 2019 as a response to the pattern of operating in silos across the three spheres of government. The DDM is a model that consists of a process of joint planning across the three spheres of government, resulting in a single strategically focused plan for each of the 44 district municipalities and the 8 metros. However, the model is established against a backdrop of the district municipalities that are dysfunctional and in financial distress, and a local government sector that is deteriorating. The question is whether the district municipalities are well positioned and capacitated to play the leading role envisaged by the DDM. The review needed to undertake a comprehensive analysis of the powers and functions of district municipalities as well as the funding framework, with a view of making the recommendation of how district municipalities can be repositioned to play the envisaged role. Next slide, please. The findings from the report shows that district municipality of local government consists of two types. You have the C1 districts, which are classified as those without powers as they do not provide bulk water supply services, and C2 are with powers as they supply bulk water. As in other categories of municipalities, the funding framework for district comprises of 4 funding sources: intergovernmental transfers, investments, borrowings, and other own revenue sources. On average, own revenue accounts for approximately 20%, whereas intergovernmental transfers constitutes approximately 75% of district municipalities' revenue sources. Government transfers to district consist largely of the REC replacement grant and the local government equitable share. However, some districts do not receive the basic component of the local government equitable share, particularly those that are not water and sanitation authorities, and they rely mainly on the REC replacement grant to fund their operations. Next slide, please. These two figures illustrates the allocation to district municipalities for the 2021-22 financial year in both the local government equitable share and the REC replacement grant. What we can see is that the REC replacement grant shows glaring biases across districts. There is a huge variation in the size of the allocation. For example, the highest allocation in the 2021-22 financial year on the REC levy was 438.2 million rand compared to the lowest allocation of 14.9 million rand. These variations are not linked to population size or even to the number of indigent households in the area. The allocation are primarily based on the historical collection patterns of the REC levies. Next slide, please. This shows the link between the REC replacement levy grant and the functions. The figure shows that there is a correlation between the proportion of functions provided by the district and the REC replacement grant. The principle of funding follows function is a pillar of an efficient system. This means that there is a link between the functions and the required funding instrument is an important one for any government structure that is a recipient of the transfer. The link between the two variables are weak and even slightly negative in some instances. This means, to a certain extent, DMs with fewer functions are allocated larger REC replacement grants compared to DMs with more functions. Next slide, please. The findings with regards pertaining to the interviews, the analysis reveals that district municipalities face challenges that may hinder them from playing the crucial role envisaged by the DDM. These challenges include the financial constraints as well as the uncertainty regarding the powers and functions and the adjustment of the powers and functions by the MEC of local government. Municipal officials are calling for COCTA to define and standardize the powers and functions of both district and local municipalities. As part of the review, a number of officials has been interviewed. There is consensus among the interviewees was that they all held the DDM in a high regard, but lament the current funding framework of the district municipalities that is often not aligned to the functions. Interviewees agreed that Section 84 and 85 of the MSA that rendered the local government sector dysfunctional as there is a confusion and duplication, and this may threaten the success and rollout of the plan. Next slide, please. There are 3 recommendations made for this chapter. The recommendation from the Commission is that COCTA should speedily review and repeal Section 84 of the Municipal Structures Act to streamline the powers and functions of district municipalities to respond with those of local municipalities. The Commission advice to COCTA is that the adjustment of powers and functions should be followed by the adjustment of funding to correlate with the powers and functions. And National Treasury should immediately abolish the REC replacement grant, combine the local government equitable share for districts and the REC replacement grant under one funding instrument. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair and honourable members. That concludes our 2023-24 annual submission. I hand back now to for questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tseng. I'm going to now open up the floor for questions. Members, you can raise your hands. Going once, Going twice. Okay, I see Member Mackenzie's hand. Any other hands? Okay, Member Mackenzie, you can go ahead. I'll acknowledge also that it is quite a big document, so maybe some members still need to go through the full report, as this is a presentation on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'm going to leave some of my more detailed questions. I should have two questions. One is on slide number 10. If we can put up slide, do they have the latest data on slide number 10? I see it ends at 2015. And then, if they do have it, because I'm keen to look at the latest data that only goes up to 2015. And the question I ask all the time, and I'm going to ask it again. Some of these findings that they've prevented, including on slide number 13, the second bullet points, they talk about the political world, ethics, integrity, institutionalization in government. Have the FFC ever considered, and if it can be answered here or not, I can understand, at some point considering legal action about some of their recommendations? Because some of the things some of us know, because it has massive impacts that we've seen through many years of the recommendations not being taken into account, and where we are today. I mean, the social grant system is consistently under pressure. I mean, a lot of these things we've seen. I mean, the recommendations on chapter 5, you know, I mean, where does this discussion stop and ends from the late Mr. Plakis? I mean, may God, may soul rest in peace. I mean, where is this going if these recommendations consistently not being implemented? Thank you.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to check whether Ms. Murray had a question, because your hand is still up. If not, I can then lower your hand, because I know you're on the same device.
No, Chairperson, she's covered.
Perfect. Member Brankhuis.
Thank you very much, Chair. Chair, yes, on the slide number 49 on the discussion on the districts, and thank you very much to the department for the presentation. As districts will play an ever more important role going forward, I would like to know from the Commission that what is the possibility of having a policy for districts in terms of them having their own budgets going forward? Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you so much. I want to come in on the chapter regarding the health and social and education findings. I can't remember which slide specifically it was now, but it spoke about costing how much health and education requires for those particular budgets, especially because they are considered in the provincial equitable share funding formula. I do know this is something that we've spoken about also in the Western Cape at one of our Money Bills workshops, but I wanted to find out whether the FFC has started any of such costings, given that one of the recommendations is for such a more comprehensive costing model to be investigated. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and honourable members for the questions. Let me just address them in turn, I think in reverse order, because since that is the freshest on the mind. I think, so FFC, yes, we following this this year's submission and research done, we're now going forward. In the next submission, actually, we are looking at developing that that's staple costing model for specifically for education. You perhaps recall that back in 2001, we already been, as Commission, been calling for costed norms approach to especially these important intergovernmental fiscal relations and allocations and formulas at that point. So back then, the excuse, I want to even put it there, that FFC received was that there was a lack of data. Now, 21 years later, we'd like to see that if that is still the case, because that would mean that it's quite static, isn't it, on the part of the executive branch of government in implementing on this regard. This is very important in the sense that I would just want to also emphasize that perhaps in the presentation it said inconsistencies. What we don't mean is that they should be consistent. What we meant is that we note the inconsistencies and we perceive that to be due to the lack of understanding on how this education or health or these elements or components are costing in the these geographical areas, and then also the local context and challenges faced in terms of provincial social services. So I want to make that clear, because I know it's been always become a touchy subject. We at FFC, we are not saying that it needs to be the same, that 48 or whatever and 27% it must go respectively go to education and health as per the weighted the weightings for those components. I think it's a very it's very misguided notion to say that it must be, because that's just not how the provincial equitable share is allocated. But we are saying that because we know these inconsistencies, but we're not understanding, right, do we, in terms of that why provinces allocates over or under that amount in terms of shares to that department. And that's why we're calling for a cost norms approach and costing of these services. Now, more technically, I think perhaps to say is that the costing approach, we are considering this new model, materials, right? So books, we're looking at infrastructure in terms of that ratio. We think that there is a sort of subsistent level, minimum level required, right? So in terms of at least infrastructure to sort of mobilize that aspect of the social service as education, as well as teachers ratios, and then also, of course, performance. And then, as you can imagine, when it comes to performance, we're trying to look beyond, of course, then just the pass rate, because that goalpost has been shifted too many times now. And so it's that consideration, and I'm just sharing with the committee some of the considerations as we are approaching this. Always the approach is for sort of researchers it's actually more important than the actual solutions to the problem. All right, moving up is the policy for district budgets. I think this one, remember, it's quite nailing it because district is tricky, and of course that its functions are not clearly sort of aligned. Yes, there is C1 and there is C2, and then we know who is who to provide water and not water and things like that. But without actually seeing it on a map, and I mean really an actual map, to know that, okay, this district, inside this district, it's got however many municipalities, and then and it's due to its vicinity to certain basic services and infrastructures. That's how it should be budgeted for. And at the moment, it's not as, shall we say, transparent as that, right? I mean, it's now just C1, C2, and then municipalities, A, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we not sure why, say, this district, and we constantly hear it, is why certain district get more money than the other one, and then there are debates around, who deserves more and less, and ultimately it comes back to that without that local context and that zoom down to the detail. Look at the where these districts, how they are structured and where their neighbors are, and is there a mountain behind it, there's a reservoir there, there's a power generator there. All of these sort of formulas, and as much as it tries, and conditional grants, it all becomes very one size fits all. It's very uniform. And in that way, it becomes, as you can see with the RSC levies, it tends to become regressive than anything else, because it's not really directed. It's not addressing the problem at its reality. And then lastly, I think Honorable Mackenzie asked a very good question, are there any legal actions? It's funny you asked that, Honorable Member, because just yesterday, and I think it's because the Zondo reports inside, it did say that it did say about the oversight structure and the weaknesses thereof, that a member at the NCOP, actually a chair actually of the NCOP, said that FFC does not have the authority to tell government what to do, the executive branch. We are, in essence, advisors to yourself, this committee, legislature, the parliamentary structures, and it's the parliament's job to ensure that the executive branch, right, it's to exercise its oversight over the executive, to bring it to account and ask them. And this is where, quote, the member at the NCOP said, is that why didn't you, what was your consideration to the department? Why didn't you consider the FFC's recommendations? What was your consideration for not considering recommendations of the FFC? And so I think this is, we took quite a few years, I think decades, for South Africa and the whole of governments to come to this point with the commission reports, Zondo commission reports, to really spell it out for us, the power of oversight and how accountability is installed and what it means when it gets implemented. Otherwise, the risk of going into saying to the commission or any other ones, AG and which is not exactly a bad thing, to say, you now take these constitutional bodies, you now go and take legal actions. It's really, it not preferred in the sense of what systems we have. And instead of making sure that that system works, now try and, sort of bolster all this other sort of all the other instruments and try and fix a problem that is sitting so deep inside the system itself. So that's that. I think hope I answer in that way that we that the community and also the whole of the legislative branch can understand. Obviously, we have the mandate to make recommendations. We don't have the mandate to enforce it. If it gets to that point of enforcement, I think it's doable, but like for example, the Public Audit Act that got amended to say that now AG you can take legal action. Sure, that can also be strengthened, but it's not preferred because at where we are now, there's supposed to already there is the chain of accountability, the system of accountability is supposed to work on its own, and it's actually quite well stipulated and established under our our constitution. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members. More questions are definitely welcomed.
Sorry, Chairperson, just on the updated slide on page 10.
Yes.
The youth model one.
If I may, yes, I was trying to. Apologies, honourable member. The update on it. Yes, I think we can definitely supply that to the committee. Apologies. Unemployment rate. This one actually we can bring it to the latest, which is I think the first quarter of this. And first and second quarter of this year already. Apologies for that, honourable member.
Thank you so much. The second round of questions starts now, and I'm taking Member Kondla's hand first. Are there any other hands? Okay, Member Kondla, you may go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation. I've got a couple of questions which I'm very happy for the FFC. Maybe some they can either send the information later if that would suit them. But maybe starting in the previous the chapter 1 and 2, I just wanted to understand this concept of crowding out effect because for some time now, as the economic response of trying to boost growth, South Africa has always followed this infrastructure-led growth, where you pump in lots of money for infrastructure-related activities with the intention that such will therefore get more labor-intensive jobs, and therefore an increase in your job numbers. And I'm hearing you when you say, having looked or studied some of these, you have seen that this pumping of money has not necessarily created on the other side, the number of jobs. The more the money increases, the more unemployment is increasing. I'm actually interested specifically on the relationship of infrastructure spending with growth as one of the assumptions that is always made. I know even now, I think in the current financial year, both at a national level and also here in the province, you would have had both our president and our premier and ministers of finance taking that similar approach. Can you therefore give me an indication of the extent to which data has actually supported this particular assumption made in terms of infrastructure spending, considering what you have just discovered at your level? The second one, Chair, also includes, with the same kind of logic, the issue over time around a skills gap or the skills quagmire we find ourselves in the country. When one looks at what we always is argued about skills mismatch or lack of skills to sort of cohere with the market demands, I'm actually trying to understand exactly these labor market problems. Perhaps if you can simplify them for a lay person like myself to understand, because indeed, when I look at from the RDP times, to the next administration under Thabo Mbeki, which would have spoken about gear, and with gear there was a GIPSA, which was an investment into skills, and also you would have seen under Jacob Zuma the national growth, the new growth path, which has got a specific skills accord, the youth wage subsidy, and many of these interventions. And my question that I've been having just in my mind is that, are we as a country actually making sort of a calculation of the investment that we have made over time in as far as skills development is concerned, and quantitatively, how much have we spent to date in terms of skilling our human resource in the country to ready them for the kind of for the kind of growth that we prospect, and where is this money going if indeed we still are left with these kind of challenges of skills mismatch in the economy? Where exactly, what indeed has this money, this investment of youth wage subsidy and all of these other ones, what have they been buying? If we're sitting from an output level, we're sitting with this particular reality. Another one, Chair, if I may go, the social sector involvement in improving transparency. I wanted to check the extent to which we've always been speaking about, you spoke about transparency, I think, from the FFC presentation, and the extent to which even through the Zondo Commission, the such is not necessarily coming through, that it has been something that we are able to do. And there are actually two things that I want to check around transparency. Would it be correct to say, amongst others, we're still sitting with a challenge in the South African state and its institutions, where, broadly speaking, transparency has been a function of politics? And what do I mean about this? That whether you look from across national, provincial, and even local government, you find that the issue of follow-up, because you spoke about the whole economics, the whole ecosystem between, the executive and ourselves as the legislature in terms of oversight and what we're supposed to be doing. And the reality of the matter is that even with all of this ecosystem, there's still serious challenges of transparency. And that is why I'm saying, isn't it because in South Africa, what we've seen as our democracy is growing, that transparency has become a matter of politicking, between parties, whether at a national, at a provincial, or even at a local government, which at times, depending who is holding the best, you find that the transparency is actually limited to the extent through which who is in charge of that pass. And that's my other part of the question around transparency is the role, how agile is South Africa's ecosystem providing the social sector, because we have seen, if you talk about whistleblowers and other members of the public who, based on them, putting pressure on government, would demand more transparency. But I'm not sure the extent to which a social sector is actually taken serious, even in the social compacting, that government talks about across, because what one would have seen is more a bias of government to more a big business, private sector, even at network level, than the social sector is an equal partner. That actually is directly where voters are at through their formations of civil society and others, and some of these expect sort of organization to help the kind of transformation that we were talking about. So I think, let me stop there. I think those are just my questions, particularly in chapter 1 and chapter 2 that you would have raised earlier on. Thanks.
Thank you so much. What I'm also going to do, Mr. Singh, is I'm also going to allow members, given that the report is so comprehensive, I've only read a few of the chapters. I haven't even gotten to, I think, some of the middle or later chapters. That I'm going to allow members to also submit questions in writing through the Budget Committee to the FFC.
just so that we are able to ensure that when we have our input on the budgetary process for next year, that we are fully equipped with the financial calculations and advice that you have put before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Honourable Nkondlo, and thank you, and thank you, Chair, for giving me a chance to answer to these very pertinent questions. I think we, of course, if you have the time, I would love to carry on with this for quite some time, actually, because I think it's all the issues that really has seized us as a country, and it doesn't matter where we are, actually. So let me try and get to them. Number one, infrastructure spend data. I think overall, if I may, this about crowding out effect is that it's a crowding out because of, like I said, something you spend in intervention is installed, but it's actually giving us the opposite effect. And all of this to do with infrastructure-led growth. What happened to it? Why didn't it work? I think there are quite a few instances or factors that kind of influenced the this infrastructure-led growth. So much so that I think it kind of mutated it. If I may, give a few examples. So first one I want to bring out is this. You remember, and since I see Honourable Member has got a very rich history, it's historical knowledge as well, is that there was a time when this very strongly came through, this idea about economic infrastructure versus social infrastructure, right? And then that for quite some time it was labeled, shall I say, slogan in such a way that social infrastructure, things like education, health, and there are, in a sense, investments of a kind. But when it comes to jobs and a way of productivity, and it needs a particular, shall we say, a way of shade that has to give us the economic benefits in terms of income and returns. And then that is as much as it's just one sort of, shall we say, factor that I'm tabling before you, and as I pause there, because I think often when it makes me, I don't want to sound, and I'm not at all a capitalist, but it is a reality. One has to recognize that in terms of economic growth, when we mean infrastructure, it means infrastructure that will give us that economic benefit and that growth, and so that there are jobs created. And when there are jobs created, there's income created, and when there's income created, there's demand, and demand pushes supply, and then that's how you grow. And all of this, when it comes to suddenly this sort of economics infrastructure versus social infrastructure, and then there is investment, and then into education and health and others, and then the whole thing, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm just saying that it becomes convoluted, more convoluted than what its original baseline interpretation and implication of economic growth is established. And also, the truth of the matter is that infrastructure, when it comes to infrastructure and sort of growth, fixed growth capital, all that technical terms, SOCs actually invest a lot of it. And SOCs like Eskom, Water Board, these ones, Transnet, PRASA, I think I don't need to go into the details there to show that yes, maybe they invested in infrastructure, and they may be infrastructure-led growth, and definitely benefited them, especially since the around 2000s, and definitely Eskom since 2007, when they realized there's something terribly going wrong. Maintenance is not done. Infrastructure is not actually focused into maintenance and in keeping those plants alive. I think that's just infrastructure. It may be labeled economic classification on the budget and on the annual report, but reality is that that side of the investment is deteriorating in its quality. Further is another side, and that's what I mean, multiple sides coming to this sort of infrastructure, and that resulted in this infrastructure-led growth not working, I guess, is this 3 spheres. Infrastructure means or capital expenditure means very different things amongst 3 spheres. National government, I mean departments. Infrastructure is hardly talking about like even, you know, build like SOCs or basics infrastructure, all those things. National government, it means buildings, government buildings, administrative buildings, are there lights, you know, just the structure, admin building, offices, if you like. Provincial, more social infrastructure, like, you know, it's schools, hospitals, these things. And then lastly, local government, basic infrastructure, basic services infrastructure, water, electricity. So when we say infrastructure, really it's all of that, right? And it's hard to say that all of them shall give us a constant level of return, economic return from that infrastructure, or investment, or gross fixed capital formation, whatever we call it. And that's what makes this, I think, this whole overall, over the years, even though there was this talk of infrastructure-led growth, that's how we are going to grow. It just didn't quite land properly there, or resulted in this sort of new normal, they call it. But actually, it just means that we are not growing as fast as we ever used to be now. You know. Further on to the so that I think also explains what the data of the infrastructure spent. Where did it go and how did it go? The ultimate truth is that it's not transparent, which goes on to the and I must say it's not transparent all the way to the point of budgeting, actually, because, you know, budgeting it's in its naive form. The baseline form is always taking what happened last year or what happened before, and then bringing the forward. And so if your past isn't clear and isn't transparent and not sure where the money has gone to going forward, it's quite likely that it's that opaqueness and ambiguity is only going to continue. In terms of skills gap, I think if I may jump straight to the ultimate conclusion of that, and my advice is that I think South Africa really suffered when it thought of skills development and all these, you know, just upskilling and these things only happens in the classroom or in the textbooks. It does not only happen in education. It's a live thing. It's an all the time thing. And I think one thing that South Africa really missed out on is that job skill, on the job skills, the apprenticeship, you know, the training or the practicals that really gets people, young people, into the job markets even slightly earlier than it's his or her 18th birthday, so that not just that you know, somebody is sitting in the, you know, working with theories in the classrooms, but also actually doing the job and getting that soft skills down in terms of how to hold a job down. What are your capabilities, and even simple things like Excel and Word, and how to write, how to speak, how to deliver or present. These things don't just happen in the classrooms. No one can tell you how you should or must present. It depends on the context. It depends on the situations on the day. So all of those things only can come through, and I think it can come through these jobs and early job and sort of entrance for creating jobs and for young people to get on into it so that they can learn these soft skills. And I think because of that, and education in terms of schools and varsities and technical colleges, that's why I think we are at a point of mismatch, because I'm not talking about, say, if it's great if someone is, job matched in terms of like went to university and then come out to get a job, but just in the unfortunate cases of, shall we say, you just missed that one boat, missed the boat by 1 year, right? And then because of that, there are new entrants. Okay, so you miss the next boats, and then the next boats, and then carry on further by year 3. The stuff we say a young person maybe learn, or even myself learn, say 3 years ago, I might have forgotten about it. So my skills become totally obsolete and unusable. And that's how that mismatch starts to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And honorable chair members, the type of our labor market unemployment is really one that is of structural. What that means is that the people that didn't get a job, say, on his first day in the labor market as an active participant, his or her employability just is immediately shot up. And very, very unlikely that, say, by year 10, right, that person will be able to find another job. It's very difficult, very unlikely, and nevertheless, he or she will have to start anyway from slightly lower than that, and to try and catch up, which is also, it's not an easy task, I might add. So ultimately, last question, Chair. Transparency, politics. Is it political? Yes, it is. But I would argue that it's not all of it. For instance, I think it's also got elements. Remember, government is run by not just politicians, but also a whole army of public sector civil servants in the department. And therefore, I would ask the question, why is it still not transparent? I think we really need to ask them, not just the politicians, but also those civil servants. Why have they not informed you as the executive member? I'm speaking as if, it's between the executive authority and the accounting officers and the civil servants. Is like, why have they not informed the executive authority to make sure that he or she is well informed of these places in the budget, or maybe in the budget document, maybe in the expenditure reports, or maybe the revenue reports, and all these procurement reports, even, I would say, and audit reports. Why haven't they pointed these and explained these gaps and these ambiguities inside these reports to the executive authority? And I think that answers itself, though, because as one can perhaps understand, is that maybe they don't want to make it too transparent because it's too troublesome for them. So, and that's where oversight, accountability, and management must come in. I thank you, Honourable Chair, members, for the very interesting questions and engagement, and I hope to have added some value here. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I think I can speak for everyone that the FFC does wonderful work for us here in the Western Cape, and advice that you give us in order for us to consider for our budgetary inputs. With that, I'm not going to go into much detail, but members, Ms. Kamish Ahmad has assisted me with just engaging with legal on the money bills matters for the draft templates for us and type of deadlines and updating the project plans. I'm meeting with the legal team next week again just to go through the updates on that project plan for us based on the previous meetings inputs. And then if you can just keep an eye on your emails so that once you receive some further feedback on that, that you know that those deadlines can be put into your calendar. But with that, I'm going to say thank you to the FFC. If you have any other business to go about in your day, you're more than welcome to leave. We are going to now continue with committee administration. So members, if you can just please stay online for that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, honourable members.
In terms of committee administration, I know we had a little bit of technical difficulties earlier today, but I would like to now, during this stage, formally welcome Member Murray to the Budget Committee as a permanent member. I think you may enjoy it, you may not. I always say that in the Budget Committee, we are making finance fun again, but not every member agrees with me. Ms. Kamish Ahmed, if we could put the minutes up, that would be appreciated. Thank you so much. So yeah, members, you will see the minutes of the 29th of July. And if we can just quickly go up to the top of the page so that members can just check their attendance, please. Okay, can go down, page 1. Can go down, page 2. There we're at the briefing on the performance report and then the resolutions. And then that's just mine at the end. So colleagues, if I could have a mover for the minutes.
Thank you, Chairperson. We move.
Thank you so much. If I could have a seconder for the minutes.
I second, Chair.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. The minutes are therefore adopted. Colleagues, with that, there are no other matters on the agenda. I just ask that you please do keep an eye out on your emails for when you do get the update on the project plan and related matters. Thank you so much. I hope you stay safe, stay warm, and have a lovely weekend. The meeting is adjourned.
Chairperson and everybody else have a lovely day.